Fashion has always reflected culture across time. It can give us information about history, psychological phenomena, and individual self expression. For example, when looking at clothing from the 1950s, we gain access to valuable information about what was socially acceptable for the time. In the broader field of psychology, we refer to socially acceptable traits in behaviors as norms. This is short for normative behaviors. Some fashion trends represent social norms, while others are alternative or countercultural pieces. The video essay will focus on how rock stars, beginning in the mid 20th century, have characterized the aesthetic extremities of both pop culture and counterculture. Ultimately, my goal is to ask why these patterns occur and better understanding how social psychology figures into these patterns. So I ask, how do they affect us then and now? For this reason, my study will be multidisciplinary in nature, as it covers the fields of media studies to understand cultural icons, gender studies to further examine what makes the fashion choices of said icons disruptive in nature, as well as psychology for the sake of understanding the shifting perceptions of these individuals. To better understand the historical implications of this study, we must first take a look at notable past examples of fashion via gender-defining artists. This will make it necessary to examine icons from each quote-unquote era of rock and roll and which norms they either defend or bring into question. In doing so, I ask, how did we get to this present moment? Rock and roll is a culmination of several musical genres, primarily including pop, country, R&B, typically understood to have begun formally developing in the 1950s. Our examination will begin with the self-proclaimed true king of rock and roll, Little Richard, who was born Richard Wayne Penniman on December 1932, who remains notable for his very flamboyant and androgynous fashion sense. According to Professor Ben Saunders, writing for the University of Oregon's The Conversation, Little Richard's music is deeply rooted in underground tradition of queer black performance and was inspired by artists like the Prince of Blues, Billy Wright, and S.Q. Escarita Reader. In an interview with BBC in 1972, Richard expresses his affinity for makeup and shiny clothing as he declares himself the beautiful Little Richard from down in Macon, Georgia, the king of rock and roll. After playing a characteristic piano riff, during the interview, we see Richard's signature fashion sense work as he dons a light pink blouse that exposes his midriff, adorned with copious sequins all along the edges, a thin pencil mustache, and a headband reminiscent of a crown. Describing his beginnings in Georgia, Richard describes growing up with 6 brothers and 5 sisters, before noting that he was the best-looking one of all of them, and I'm not conceited at all. Proudly lifting the sequin bottom of his blouse, Richard notes that his siblings don't like to dress like he does. I like to put it on. I like to shine. Richard jokes that men at the grocery store stopped to look at him in London's airport, and a man dropped his coffee when he saw him. For Richard, wearing makeup is a necessity, just like he says when you toast your bread or put sugar on your coffee, according to the BBC archive. In an article by Raisa Britannia, she discovers how Little Richard found his flamboyant style. Britannia explains that he found an interest in makeup and refined looks early on, and then became a bolder person with his style during a period known as the Peacock Revolution. In the Peacock Revolution, Regina Lee Blasiak suggests that young men rejected sartorial drabness for creative expression. No doubt influenced by his time touring with the Stones and the Beatles, Britannia describes how Richard's participation in the Peacock Revolution helped in challenging traditional notions of gendered dressing. It injected menswear with effeminacy not seen since the 18th century. Nevertheless, it would be disingenuous to suggest that Little Richard's exploratory fashion aesthetic was only due to his time in the UK. Richard had a stint as a drag performer before he made it into the music industry. However, the makeup Richard wore as a rock and roll sensation was not about female impersonation, but rather about enhancing his natural features. As John Savage describes, Richard's queer expression was likewise entangled with racial politics of the mid-20th century in America. He says, Richard's recollections of his experience in the entertainment underbelly of the Deep South are full of sliding between gender and sexuality. Doubly cast in Doubly outcast in 1950s America, black homosexuals simply got on with it and did as they pleased. I personally find it very interesting that the king of rock and roll has some roots with drag culture, which is seen as a medium of queer expression very heavily focused on breaking gender norms. The sense of eccentricity in Little Richard's style pushed the boundaries of social norms at the time, saying men can dress effeminately and wear makeup too, creating a path for future rock stars to contribute to that same aesthetic. In a sense, Little Richard's adoption of his signature look represents how the first generation of rock and rollers, dominantly from minority communities, created a basis of queer fashion trends in the rock industry. Looking back on his legacy, we can understand how people viewed him as different than others for his outward appearance, how manipulating gender and clothing can disrupt social norms, and of course, how to make people drop their coffee. As rock comes into its own genre by the 1970s, we can take another progress check in fashion. If you think of rock stars, fashion, and the 70s, David Bowie, originally known as David Jones, must come to mind. According to Andrew Trendell, Bowie's pre-fame life was made up of family, frustration, and failure in his article, David Bowie's First Years. Bowie was originally inspired by American art rock, 1960s folk balladry, and a whole lot of Cockney theatricality inspired by 60s screen icon Anthony Newley. But he was known to dabble in many forms of musical expression reflective of queer culture that ultimately shaped the genderless image he presented. Bowie was openly bisexual and he expressed this frequently. His signature style reflected his creative nature and queer identity, as he once said, "My music has to visually look how it sounds." According to Will Stroud from Attitude magazine, his album, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, screams nonconformity. Part of Bowie's obsession with his otherworldly fashion comes from his anxieties around isolation, according to Trendell. Instead of retreating into himself, Bowie displayed his otherness through a culmination of odd looks. Unlike Little Richard, who argued he could still be flamboyant and comfortable in his manhood, Bowie creates his character Ziggy Stardust as a form of gender expression outside the binary altogether. His style was both the tool and consequence of his self-creation. He was the only animal of his species. Bowie was unlike anybody and no one was like him, according to Sierra Knoll magazine. For example, in his Starman music video, Bowie can be seen in flamboyant sequin pantsuits, women's shoes, and hair and makeup reflective of Little Richard's look, but with an added element of otherness that characterizes his alien persona. After Ziggy, Bowie took on other personas as well, like the Thin White Duke of Berlin and Aladdin Sane. While many media outlets label Bowie as simply a gay man, he fought back against the quick judgments with frustration, challenging the way we perceive gender and sexuality norms with his openness. For this reason, Bowie is somewhat beloved with the modern queer youth scene, who admires his commitment to stray from boxes and labels with his art. After all, Stroud himself calls him the godfather of queer culture. Bowie's fashion and the appreciation of it thereof shows the psychological evidence of the appreciation of authenticity within art. I find this is a good place to sit back and define what I mean when I say the word queer. Let's examine that. Before the 19th century, the term queer meant strange, odd, peculiar, or eccentric, but moving forward into modern times has come to refer to homosexuality, and then as an umbrella term for members of the LGBTQ+ community, according to Jones. Jones explains that activists and groups such as Queer Nation also used this critical sense as a part of their more assertive and anti-assimilationist political actions. Therefore, queerness is defined as breaking what society may deem as normative behavior from a psychology perspective. The psychology of fashion points out that fashion can be used as a tool for enhancing well-being because fashion expresses who we are, our personality and identity, through nonverbal communication. Molly Knight argues that queer aesthetics are less of a defined checklist and more of a relationship between presentation and perception from the individual and the onlooker, meaning that in order to make something inherently queer, physical appearances will not alone cut it. There is an element of queer culture and fashion that cannot be fully falsified, because to queer something is to disrupt norms and make people question their own biases about gender and sexuality in social structures. In my opinion, fashion can be a political tool used to make aversive statements, and this is something marginalized communities have done for a long time. In an article by the company We Create Space from 2022, several queer people are asked how their fashion interacts with their identity, and overwhelmingly, the results show that LGBTQ plus people do feel an interaction between their true selves and how they express themselves through fashion. This brings home the point that becomes central to my overall argument that authenticity is ultimately the key element that defines whether or not we perceive rock and roll fashion as queer. While performances like Bowie's are generally seen by the queer community as authentic, the 70s onward shows us a cultural shift in expectations for rock and rollers. What was once seen as going against the grain starts to become popular forms of fashion within this community. As stadium rock, which is also defined as mainstream and radio-friendly rock designed to appeal to a large audience, also known as corporate rock, begins to boom, it becomes socially acceptable for the white male rock star to dress effeminately as rock becomes more commercialized, according to Joyner. This is a common conflict in rock history, where what has once been seen as breaking boundaries gets picked up by big labels, and they attempt to replicate that for profit. Bowie himself has made commentary on this phenomenon in relation to the band Kiss, saying, "Butch, manly glam with lots of fireworks, muscle, and metal. No mistaking the sexual bent of those fellas. Nothing ambiguous about our boys. That's the only way Ohio could accept lipstick on males," according to Gross and Rock. Photographer Mick Rock explained in regards to some 70s rockers, "Boys that looked like girls get the hippest girls." This asserted that the androgynous style did not always represent queerness. We can see why Bowie would make this comment, given that Kiss has a specific style that it does pull from effeminate traits into a more macho rock aesthetic. Their performance of gender differs from that in Bowie and Little Richard in a sense that Kiss fans don't wonder if Gene Simmons is exploring his own gender identity or if he's promoting a genderless world. You could play I Was Made for Lovin' You at a conservative Southerners party, and everyone would sing along, and then probably vote against gay rights in the next possible election. From a psychological perspective, this is extremely interesting. It shows that fashion itself without substance is not enough to be what we call queer. As consumers, we're demanding both creativity and authenticity. As we enter into the 1980s, this phenomenon continues. David Bromfield argues that rock's contentiousness, however, stems from the commercial threats to which rock has been subjected, discussing the disagreement in opinion over the exact definition of the qualifications of rock. This video essay argues that genuine presentations of individuality in clothing in performance is what separates rock and rollers from musicians to revolutionary artists. We see the contrast between rockers like Freddie Mercury of Queen versus rockers who belong to the hair metal genre, and we can use an example of rock cultures pushing against commercialism. Freddie Mercury, born Farrokh Bulsara to Parsi parents who had emigrated from India to Zanzibar, where his father worked as a clerk for the British government. He was never one to shy away from being different throughout his life. He was influenced by the hard-edged blues-based style of rock acts such as Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and then eventually teamed up with fellow band members Roger Taylor, Brian May, and John Deacon. Queen was originally a British rock band whose fusion of heavy metal, glam rock, and camp theatrics made it to one of the most popular groups of the 1970s, according to Britannica. As their frontman, Freddie was frequently characterized as flamboyant in both his performance style and dress, sporting tight suits and bright colors, as well as his signature mustache later in his career. I find it very intriguing how this style is so reminiscent of Little Richard and Bowie's, with the addition of some 80s flair in his aesthetics. Queen's iconic music video for I Want to Break Free by Queen features all members in drag while they sing of liberation and freedom, hinting at perhaps a desire for self-expression, especially for Mercury, who experimented with his sexuality and gender presentation. Drag, while having always existed, became more associated with homosexuality around the 19th century, around the time this music video would have aired. Queen has a certain authentic flair about their looks. Their images scream self-expression, whilst to me personally, hair bands seem copy and paste. This may be due in part to Freddie Mercury being so open about his sexuality like seen with Bowie. His fashion is an honest portrayal of his feelings, which makes me deem his performance of gender more respectable than that of, say, Kiss. In order to back up my claims comparing the authenticities of the previously mentioned artists, let's take a minute to systemically define authenticity from a psychological perspective. In The Psychology of Authenticity by George Newman, Newman concludes the study of authenticity can be put into three categories: whether the item embodies the physical essence of some valued source, also known as historical authenticity, whether the item or experience conforms to the essential qualities of the particular category type, categorical authenticity, and whether the item/experience reflects a deep essential values authenticity. I would argue that Queen, for instance, will rate higher in these categories than Kiss. Kiss may have some historical and categorical authenticity, but they are completely lacking in values authenticity. Their gender presentation as a group does not reflect any deeper context, but is rather a manufactured version of a trend created by queer people. That is not to say straight rockers did not ever bend gender norms. After all, the famous Aerosmith hit, Dude Looks Like a Lady, was written about Vince Neil. Steven Tyler, Aerosmith's frontman, wrote about spotting an attractive girl with teased, bleached blonde hair that actually turned out to be Vince Neil from Motley Crue, who indeed did have some pretty luscious hair. The sentiment behind Tyler's narrative is interesting because it suggests some queerness on Neil's part in an almost derogatory way, essentially teasing or making fun of him. I find this hilariously ironic because while poking fun at Neil, Tyler nearly admits he is attracted to him. To add insult to injury, Vince Neil is not nearly as effeminate or gender-bending compared to the queer stars we have discussed. He sported long hair and tight pants with lots of colors and tattoos. Overall, nothing revolutionary or groundbreaking. Tyler says Neil had the body of Venus, the Roman goddess of love, accompanied by other suggestive lyrics in the song. Tyler suppresses his sexual attraction to the figure of the song and turns it into a joke because he is uncomfortable outright saying that he found himself attracted to a man. The sheer irony of this song fits into my thesis because it shows psychological reaction to gender in bending clothing that is negatively compared to positive presentations we have previously discussed. In The Psychology of Fashion, people's reactions to clothing is discussed, saying that fashion is an instant visual communication to be interpreted and responded to by those we interact with, suggesting it can derive meaning not only from clothing itself, but how individuals react to it. Aerosmith shows us how, to some people, alternative aesthetics are not only acceptable until they cross the line of actually making the insecure struggle. As we step from the 90s into the 2000s and modern times, where does this leave rock fashion, queer fashion, and what it means to us? In general, we can see less audience acceptance of figures who lack authenticity, and this trend certainly applies to the music industry and its fashion. I would argue that the decrease in acceptance of commercialized alternative fashion is due to audience awareness. As I said before, the difference in how we react to fashion as it comes in different forms indicates that we resonate more with authenticity. After all, as psychology journalist George Newman suggests, authenticity drives consumer preferences across a number of domains, including art, clothing, luxury goods, collectibles, food and beverage, and everyday household products. We see that in artists like Benson Boone, who has become a modern-day joke to young adults. Benson appears to sport an amalgamation of rock fashion in his pop performances, but he is widely laughed at. He can be seen wearing sequined and flamboyant jumpsuits while sporting a mullet and a mustache, reflective of the styles of Freddie, Bowie, and Little Richard. However, if we take a look into his history, he looked nothing like this in his American Idol years. The vast transformation may be a slight indication that Boone may be replicating a certain style for performance rather than actually portraying his true self. Harry Styles has been criticized for similar behaviors because he isn't exactly a pioneer, according to Trudell, who goes on to criticize Styles for benefiting from historically queer aesthetics while not directly speaking on his own sexuality. I would argue that our distaste for Benson Boone in the year of 2025 is indicative of a psychological shift in how we perceive breaking gender norms. I would argue that perhaps we're becoming more salient to the fact that we are being marketed to all of the time, and that makes us more critical consumers. So the question is, where do we go from here? I, for one, think that being a critical consumer is always a good thing. You will find most psychologists will say the same. Evaluating things and using complex thought allows us to form our own genuine opinion on a topic, which is something that is becoming harder and harder to do as information becomes globalized. I will offer my opinion that there lies a balance between both being a critical consumer and holding out some hope for the arts. After all, queer artists like Chapel Roan give us an example of genuine progress and expression, as a lesbian woman brings her sexuality front and center to people with her music and fashion. In this day and age, we hold the power of our attention. Who we deem worthy of giving it to is important. Perhaps we should give the attention to those whose art we find important and amplify the voices that need to be heard. The modern consumer must demand both authenticity and self-expression.